really is a great honor to be here, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. It's also a great honor to be part of what is called the Bruce Kennedy Visiting Scholar Program. I had an opportunity to take a look at Bruce Kennedy. I didn't know much about him before I came here, but he's probably some of you know, he's the former CEO of Alaska Airlines. He's a man of deep faith and also of robust action. And in many respects, I suspect that he actually embodies the theme of this talk that I'm about to give. Because here we are not just simply trying to talk about ideas, but we have to see witnesses. Because if we can't see people who've lived these things out in real life, it's hard for us to, in a sense, become imitators of what they're doing. And Bruce Kennedy, it seems to me, embodied much of this. And I'm sure many of you probably hear about him at this university, since he was such an important figure in this university. So it's a great honor. I've also spent the last 24 hours with faculty from this university, along with faculty from other places, talking about what does it mean to be a faithful business. We talked about a lot about this question of a benefit corp, and it has really been a great joy to be here, to see a community of people taking these questions very seriously. This morning, what I'd like to do is share the contents of this document called The Vocation of the Business Leader. And it comes out of the Catholic tradition and is produced by a Vatican office called the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. I realize, of course, that I'm sitting here in a Protestant university, and in many respects, it's very hard to even stomach the idea that a Catholic would be talking to Protestants about the word vocation, since most of the Protestants, and particularly Luther, took that question very seriously, where Catholics, particularly for lay people, in a sense, downplayed it in a serious part of its history. But it does seem to me that this is precisely an area where there's great ecumenical convergence, where Catholics and Protestants have much to, in a sense, be in union with. Actually, I was part of the writing of the document, and when we were writing the document, I gave it to several of my Protestant friends, particularly one CEO who actually I serve on the board of. His name is Kyle Smith, very committed evangelical Protestant. And he was very helpful to us to recognize that this document should be written in a tone in which all Christians can participate in. And I think if you read the document, you would see that precise manner. Protestants and Catholics have differences, but this is not one of them. And so I see a great sense of convergence, and it's a great honor to be at this university to do this. The document is structured very simply. It's what they call the see, judge, act structure. See the problem, judge it with the right principles, and find actions in which to do it. I am not going to give you a summary of this document, but I am going to highlight particularly the act section. And I hope it will be not quite what you think it might be. And hopefully I'll give a good enough example of it. So this idea of the vocation of the business leader from career to calling. My hope in this talk is that the topic of vocation will not simply be seen as simply a bunch of concepts, but if anything, it's precisely your story, not my story, but your story can come to light on this. C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man has a great line on this. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." What is the deep meaning of our story? Everyone in this room has a view of work. You may not articulate it very well, you may not have been explicit about it, but each one of us has a view of work, and that view comes from the stories of our lives. It is why our stories are so important. But interpreting those stories can be difficult. I suspect, precisely because you're sitting in the chairs right now, there are many stories in your life that are wonderful, positive stories that got you here. Your parents, your background, your grandparents, your brothers and sisters, your teachers, all the communities out of which you come from, has given you great stories for the reason why you're here. But the human condition being what it is, not all our stories are great stories. We have baggage, and we have to deal with that baggage, and hopefully purify those stories in such a way that we can, in a sense, improve in this. Let me give you one concrete example of this. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I am a Midwest boy, and so I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and both my parents are from Ireland. And I was about 16, and I was walking out the door one night, Saturday night, and my father looked at me, and he said, Michael, you be a good boy, Michael. I said, sure, Dad, whatever, you know. And before I can take one more step, he looked at me and he said, Now, Michael, if you can't be good, you be careful. All right, I can try that. Right? Well, an unfortunate event happened to me that night. I'll spare you the details, but my father had to come pick me up from the Chicago police station. And he walked into the police station, he looked at me, he says, Michael, I think you better just be good. Now, my father and I had a lot of struggles in which to deal with in life, but the episode highlights, I think, a particular modern problem. We are so fixated on being careful. Our culture drives it in so many ways, and thus we have designated drivers, safe and careful drivers who take home drunk and stupid friends. We have this whole phenomenon called safe sex, somehow thinking that non-productive, disease-free sex can sometimes make up for its unitive and procreative meaning. We have an educational system that is so fixated on grades and scores to get into the next thing that we produced a whole set of students who've lost the love of learning. And for the topic of our day, our career strategies are so riddled with so much massive changes that are occurring that it is constantly demanding people to be cautious, to be careful, and yet, unfortunately, we've lost a sight of what does it mean to have good work. Now, of course, if we are not careful in the work that we do, we will find ourselves dinosaurs in the proverbial dung heap of antiquated practices. The changes that we are finding ourselves in are monumental. Pope Francis has been speaking a lot about this, and if you don't mind, I'd like to say a few things about what he's been talking about. And he says this, he says, more than an epoch of change, we are now living through a change of epoch. We are not living through an age of change. We are living through a change of the ages. Now, certainly we all know that science and technology are driving much of the change in our society. But Francis is certainly concerned about that we are living through this change of ages, and at the deepest level is this question of the culture. We have all benefited greatly from science and technology, and it has, in a sense, benefited us in such immense ways it's hard to count. But the danger of living through a change of epoch is that we've lost a sense about what should not change. If all we can speak about is being careful, about being useful, about being cautious in relation to change, especially the changes in our work, we lose sight of the deep reality of what is the good that ought not to change. And this runs into the dilemma of moral drift. And the point, and there are lots of problems of this moral drift, but let me highlight simply one of them. And it is what we call the divided life. In the document, it says this. It says, dividing the demands of one's faith from one's work and business is a fundamental error that contributes to much of the damage done by businesses in our world today, including overwork to the detriment of family or spiritual life, an unhealthy attachment to power to the detriment of one's own good, and the abuse of economic power in order to make greater economic gains. I believe one of the most significant moral philosophers of our day is a man named Alistair McIntyre. And McIntyre has coined this term called compartmentalization, that we've compartmentalized our lives to such an extent that our work is simply about being careful, utility maximization, progress for its own particular sake. Our families and our faith life has sometimes become so reduced to the idea of emotion that it's merely a private phenomenon that has very little public significance. This divided life has caused serious challenges. I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but I'd like to keep that in mind. Do we live in this divided life? If the assumption is yes, in order to overcome it, we have to ask ourselves some big questions. And so this talk is about three big questions. And the first big question is, what am I working for? You and I are simply going to work way too much in life to deprive ourselves of a good answer. And nor should we ever be content with the answer that we have. And so this is a question that should be an ongoing question. By the way, for the students that are sitting here today, don't wait in asking this question. For many of you I know, you're just saying, listen, I just want to get a job. I got to pay back the loans. I don't want to go back to my parents' basement, right? I'll deal with the meaning question later. That form of sequentialism is a very dangerous form of thinking, because what's going to happen, often will happen, is that you'll never get to the question. And then you'll be finding out that maybe I should have been asking that question years ago. This is exactly the time in which they're asking these deep questions. But here's the paradox. We'll never get a good answer to this question only from work. And thus we have to ask ourselves a second question. And this is an odd question. What am I resting in? And this is the question that often deals with the dilemma or the issue about what does not change. We are made to work, Genesis tells us, and we are made to rest. As Augustine once put it, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. There's something about the deep restedness of this reality that gives the stability to life. And if we can ask these two questions, by the way, not in some type of balance act, because if I simply see my work over here and my rest over there, that simply perpetuates the divided life. Balance does not solve all our problems. It has a role to play, but it's one of those overused words that we simply constantly use that thinks going to solve the problem. What we need to be asking the question is, what is the integration of these two? And that comes to our third question. What am I living for? What am I living for? Now, there's something about an academic, I don't know what it is, but when we ask these questions, somehow we seem to have to put it into a matrix. I don't know what it is. My apologies for this. I'm sure if I was a better man, I'd be able to avoid the matrix, but I'm going to use it. Let me highlight two things. This is simply, and actually, if we had more time, I would actually make more boxes, which would even make you more dizzy and more annoyed. So it's just by a 2x3 matrix. We'll just keep it at that. It's simply a pedagogical tool. I am not trying to explain life through boxes. You are way too complex to be put in boxes. But as a pedagogical tool, it can get some ideas out for us to have a conversation. So that's point number one. Point number two is I have a thesis. Every academic likes to have a thesis. And so here's the thesis, and you might want to challenge me on this thesis at the end of the talk. And the thesis is this. If we don't get leisure right, if we don't get rest right, we'll never get work right. Okay? Or put it another way, if we don't get the good right, we'll never get the change right. So keep that in the back of mind as we go through. And so really this part of the talk, I'm going to start right down in the bottom left-hand corner, just go right across, and give you two ways in which people look at their work, how they look at their leisure or their rest, and how they put it together. There's more than these two. We don't have time to go through all, there's several of them. But these two, I think, capture particularly a cultural phenomenon and in particularly a Christian phenomenon. So, view number one. Some people look at work as a career. Some people, by the way, look at their work as a job. It's simply, the payment that they have. I hope for many of you that you're going through college and that you see the work that you're going to go to and you have a deep sense that there's a career dimension to it. And that you also are going into a work that you enjoy. As a matter of fact, this is the kind of characteristic of work. There is great psychological rewards. I suspect many of you have chosen your major precisely because this is something that you are attracted to. You believe you can bring your creative talents to it. You believe that a certain degree of autonomy will occur in the work that you can do, that you simply won't be a cog in the wheel. And matter of fact, that's a great thing. There's a guy who wrote a book called Flow, and he talks about the idea, there's a flow or a zone about how one feels about the task that they have in front of them and the talents they have. And often the task will stretch their talents. and that their work helps them to grow because it's always exercising the talents that they have. And they feel a great degree of control, a great degree of competence, and it captures what? You and I are made to work. The fact is, while you may win the lottery, most lottery winners are not happier, especially when they quit work. They think it will make them happier, but people are made to work. It's in our DNA. And so this idea of a career makes a lot of sense. But there's a challenge to this idea of career, and it is this. Look at the word career. The etymology of the word career is fascinating. It comes from the French, carrière, which means actually where we get the word car. It's the automobile. It's the self-driven vehicle that allows us to go from one place to the next. But in the automobile, you're this self-enwrapped glass privacy. You go on your own. And the careerist tends to only be asking the question, how does it benefit me? Often not asking the question, how does it benefit the world? Often not asking the question about whether there is a spiritual component or a vocational component. And thus, the careerist who's a leader, who sees himself as a leader, is very goal-oriented. By the way, the careerist, and this is true particularly for the entrepreneur, most entrepreneurs that I know, and we've written a book and we've done a study with a lot of entrepreneurs, most of them are not money mad, but they are goal-driven. They are very goal-driven. They are change makers, and they want to, in a sense, achieve things. And thus, the leader is goal-oriented. Now, why would somebody view their work as a career? There's lots of reasons, but let me highlight my thesis. I think it has a lot to do with the question about how they understand their leisure. And thus, we often look at our leisure, and this is not the only way in which we look at it, but increasingly we live in a total work world that sees leisure as simply mere utility, a mere function. Let me give you two examples about how this works. I'm sure this doesn't happen at Seattle Pacific University, but my university, we're constantly wrestling with the idea that education is simply justified based on its instrumental value to career. So like my students, by the way, they use the word like a lot. I don't know what it is. That's the overused word in the student today. Always try to get that word out of you. It's never a good thing for you. But nonetheless, they say, like Dr. Naughton, come on, why do I have to take theology or philosophy or art? Like what is it going to do for my career? Right? And that's a common kind of phenomenon. And thus it's very interesting that many universities, the liberal arts, are shrinking and the professional area is growing. The challenge with that attitude is that actually the whole premise of the liberal arts within the Western tradition, both from the Greeks, the Romans, in terms of the Christians, is those are the arts that would free you. Matter of fact, the very word leisure in Latin comes from a word schola, which is where we get the word school. You are at leisure. Right? I try to say that to my students. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. But that's what school was meant to be. It was meant to be an idea of leisure. The arts that free you, the liberal arts, the arts that free you, that help you to see the world in a much larger reality. It expands the horizon. That was the understanding of leisure. But today we see it simply as a utility. And thus it's caused some very significant issues going on with higher education as we speak today. But let me get to the second example, which I even find more fascinating. It's the idea that rest is justified to sharpen the saw in order to be more productive. There's a great book by Stephen Covey called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It was on the bestsellers list at New York Times. Very helpful book, very insightful. But I think that Stephen Covey may have gotten this habit a bit wrong, because it's the last habit where he talks about this idea of sharpening the saw. And the reason why I think he gets it wrong is that I think that that's not simply what rest is about. There's a Hungarian psychologist, Sándor Ferenczi, and he coined the term Sunday neurosis. It's a psychological term. And he was always puzzled about why do people tend to get depressed, a kind of low-grade anxiety, a sense of boredom occurring on Sundays. Now, the obvious answer, of course, is what? You have to go back to work on Monday. But actually, as he pressed it, what he found was that actually that wasn't the reason. The reason why they were experiencing this is that they were trying to rest, and they didn't know how to rest, and they got themselves in knots. There are some things in life you have to do for the right reason. You may not start off that way, but eventually you have to get to it for the right reason. If I love my wife simply to get things out of her, I can do all the great things in the world, but that intentionality is going to corrupt the love. And in a very similar way, the question of rest has to be done for the right reason. T.S. Eliot has this wonderful line, "To do the right deed for the wrong reason is the greatest treason." If we are to find authentic rest, it is always going to be imperative of us about the intentionality that we bring to that rest. So what does that tell us? If I look at my work as a career, and if I look at my leisure as a utility, I often look at my life in terms of my achievements, because that becomes the fundamental focus. Some people have called this careerism, that we're more concerned about what we do and less concerned about who we become in the doing. There's all sorts of examples that you can see of this. Many of you, I'm not quite sure if you're familiar with a man named Jack Welch, who was from GE, and people would say, he's a real jerk, but look what he did. Or some people have talked about Steve Jobs in that fashion. Now, I don't know the soul of Jack Welch and Steve Jobs, but there is something that sometimes we tend to excuse all sorts of behaviors because of people's achievements. That becomes an expression of this careerism. We're more concerned about what they've achieved and less concerned about what they become in the achieving. As Americans, we find this true all the time. What is often the first question we ask people? So, what do you do? Right? That's often not true in a lot of cultures. It's often not the first question. We're very focused on this idea of what people do and what they have achieved. Let me give you two examples of this that highlight it. The older group would remember a man named Lee Iacocca. Lee Iacocca was the former CEO of Chrysler Corporation. He turned Chrysler around in the 80s. He was considered the kind of icon of American industry, of what you can do in American industry, of turning it around and being a change maker in the organizations that they have. But a couple years after Lee Iacocca retired from the Chrysler Corporation, he was on the front cover of Fortune magazine with this caption, "How I Flunked Retirement." A man who was a great economic giant, a man who kind of knew exactly who he was as the CEO of the Chrysler Corporation, was a man who was lost outside of that role. An economic giant on one hand, and yet, excuse the language, a spiritual dwarf on another. One can only admire Lee Iacocca for the mere fact that he was actually that honest enough to articulate these things on the front cover. But it is interesting for a lot of professionals, not just in business, but in all areas, retirement can be a very difficult time in their lives because they got the work thing right, but they weren't quite understanding what the rest thing was about. Let me give you an example of the politics of it. You should be familiar with this man, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the great historian, I think she's really become an extraordinary historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin, wrote an article in the New York Times several years ago, and this is what she says about LBJ. She says, this man, who actually retired as the most powerful man in the world, that I saw in his retirement, had spent so many years in pursuit of work, power, and individual success, that he had absolutely no psychic or emotional resources left to commit himself to anything once the presidency was taken from him. Years of concentration solely on work meant that in his retirement, he could find no solace in recreation, sports, or hobbies, or his family, or his faith. That is, work spent him. And that's what work will do if that's all one has. This seems to me brings us to, I think, one of the most profound insights of the Christian tradition on the issue of work. And the insight is this: when you and I go to work, we got to change things. That's what we're paid for, that's what we're rewarded for, we'll be incentivized for, and we'll be evaluated on the basis of the changes. But what will not occur, of course, is what are the changes that simultaneously happen in here. And those changes are happening. And yet sometimes we can be so agnostic to those changes. And thus the work that we're doing is not only the effects out there, it's also the effect in here. And that brings us to this question of what tradition often calls the subjective dimension of work. Let me see if I can bring it down in a very simple way. I don't know if you have this in your house, whether your parents did this, but my wife, I call it refrigerator wisdom. She puts these posters on the refrigerator. I think they're all from me anyway. What I need to know. She's tired of telling me, so she just puts it on the refrigerator to let me see what is the message I need to know. This was on our refrigerator for a very long period of time. But I think it captures exactly this idea of the subjective dimension of work. And it goes like this. Many of you may know it. Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. You and I are called not just to work, but to become particular kinds of people in the work. Because here, why? The why is that our choices are the prime indicators of our destiny. They take us somewhere. That's why they're so important. They're not just simply self-choices. They point us in a direction. And from a Christian perspective, this has a profound, what they often, theologians will call, eschatological reality. We become eternally what we have given ourselves to. There is a lot at stake in the area of work. So, what does that tell us? It tells us, it seems to me, that often the way that we look at work in our culture has a serious problem. In the Vocation of the Business Leader document, it says this, and this is kind of one of those self-critiques of the church itself. The document says, Christians have accommodated themselves to the world, living as if God does not exist. They not only live in the world, but they have become of the world. When Christian leaders fail to live the gospel in their organizations, their lives conceal rather than reveal the authentic face of God and religion. This, it seems to me, is a serious problem that all Christians need to deal with. We've assimilated so much of the world that we lose the distinctiveness of what the tradition provides. There was once a survey, we did a survey of faculty in some faith-based institutions, and one of the faculty members who was in finance said this about his fellow finance faculty. He says, if I believed in God as much as they believed in the market, I'd be a mystic. Right? There's a sense that sometimes we take things, we've assimilated it, and we can't quite see the distinction of what that is in terms of our own particular faith. So, how do we respond to this? Well, obviously in the tradition, there is a great response. And that is why in the tradition, it often speaks about work as a vocation. And let me highlight a couple of things here. The word vocation comes from a Latin word called vocare, which means to call. And what I want to highlight is it is the call to give of ourselves. Let me highlight three elements of this vocation. The first is that everyone is called. By the mere fact that we are human beings, you and I are called to give of ourselves. It is often called the universal call to love, the universal call to holiness, the universal call to wholeness, right? It is by the mere fact of who we are as human beings. You and I are always at our best when we give of ourselves, not when we simply are takers, not when we're calculators, not when we're scheming. We're always at our best in terms of how we give of ourselves. In the Catholic tradition, a document called Gaudium, it says, I think captures it very well. And it says, a person cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Right? This captures much of the human reality. That is often why we describe this often, and as I'll get to it, in terms of a logic of gift, the giftedness of reality. Now, in the Christian tradition, and here I'll have to speak specifically as who I am as a Catholic, we will often talk about a state of life. That is, we give ourselves often, and many of us give ourselves in terms of the lay life, in terms of priestly life, in terms of religious life. I don't need to get into all three of those, but let me just highlight the lay life. And even in the Catholic tradition, this is where we've learned so much from the Protestant tradition. Certainly at the Reformation, Catholics downplayed the importance of the vocation of the laity. And Protestants took that up, and we have learned a lot from Protestants on that very point. And it is of critical importance. And yet, for many of us in the lay life, we often get married. And that marriage vocation is of critical importance. I once had a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Bob Kennedy, say this to me. He says, my wife only has one husband, and my children only have one dad. My students have a lot of teachers. That vocation that's often intrinsically connected to the lay vocation can never be sacrificed to the work vocation. And yet, with that said, we are called to work. And in the document it says this, and by the way, we are called not simply to a particular kind of work, but more radically, we're called to a particular way of working. If my university decides to fire me tomorrow, that doesn't mean that my vocation is no longer there. It's how I work which is key. And so the document says this, a business joins together people's gifts, talents, energies, and skills to serve the needs of others. This in turn supports the development of the people who do the work. The idea of giftedness, it is the key term, I think, to understand the nature of vocation, of work, particularly in the area of business or in any profession. And so let me highlight a couple of insights that I think is critical on this work is giving, and in particular, the logic of gift that it generates. But before I get to the Christian tradition, and particularly the document, let me highlight another tradition which is so important, and it's the Native American tradition. Because I said that the idea of the vocation is a universal call, and we'll see this in other cultures when they're at their best. You remember the story, right? When the Puritans came to this country and they encountered the Native Americans. We called them the Indians at the time. And so the encounter came up, and what did they do? They exchanged gifts. They gave each other gifts. This often happens when cultures meet each other. And they went away from each other, and then when they came back to each other, the Native Americans noticed that the Puritans still had the gifts that they gave them. And so they asked for it back, which is where we get the term Indian giver, right? There's a man named Lewis Hyde who writes about this in a very interesting book called The Gift. He's an anthropologist. Now, like what happens in most of us, and when we go to another culture and we see these strange things, we often make judgments. But we don't see the underlying reality that's happening in the culture. And here's the underlying reality. Native Americans have a deep sense that gifts are always in motion. That the gifts that are given to you are not for you, but they are to go through you to be used for others. And thus, they understand deeply the law of the gift. And it's this. You and I have been given great gifts. If we use those gifts only for ourselves, they corrupt us. The only way that these gifts help us to be fulfilled is precisely when they go through us, because they're not made for us. They are to go through us to be serving for others. And then precisely at that point, they come back in such a way of a blessing. That's how the nature or the logic of gift begins to work. And thus, in the document, it speaks about the importance of this giftedness, and particularly in terms of business, in three ways. And by the way, this is also of crucial importance. To understand any institution, like the institution of business, ask yourself, what are the goods that that institution brings? What does it generate? What does the goods of marriage generate? This is a big debate in our culture. What are the goods of government? And what happens here is, what are the goods of business? In the document, it talks about it in three ways. Good goods, meeting the needs of the world by creating goods that are truly good and services that truly serve. Good work, fostering the dignity of work by helping coworkers develop their gifts and talents. And good wealth, creating sustainable wealth so that it can be distributed justly. This is the fundamental gift that business gives the world. These are the goods that it generates, and this is why business is so radically important for our culture. But we still have a problem. Let me put it this way. I think I have a problem. I don't know about you, but I work very hard. I get up early in the morning, I work, I try to give of myself in everything I do, to my children, to my wife, to my church, to my university. But then something starts to happen. Victimization starts to set in. So why do I work 60 or 70% and they only work 30 or 40? Why am I putting in more than my wife? By the way, I don't say that to my wife, I just think it, right? But I get into this kind of victimization about why am I working so hard? And why can't they work harder? And then the victimization often leads to a certain kind of resentment. And then that resentment often neutralizes the power of the gift that I first started off in the first place. And thus then it leads often to cynicism. That is, I work really hard, but often my work tends to generate maybe not the best of attitudes in the work that I do. And that brings us, I think, to the importance of a very important insight. And by the way, as a Catholic, I can't help but quote Latin. I don't know what it is. Right? We have matrices, we have Latin. And the Latin phrase goes like this: Nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you don't have. And what work will do to you, it will exhaust you. That's what it does. And that is why the notion of leisure, the notion of rest, not as utility, but as contemplation, is so critical. In the Vocation of the Business Leader document, it says this. It says, the first act of the Christian business leader, as of all Christians, is to receive, more specifically to receive what God has done for him. Pope Benedict actually has a wonderful line when he says this: the person comes to the most profoundest sense of himself, not by what they have done, not by what they've achieved, but what they have accepted. Not by what they've achieved, but what they have received. Let me highlight more concretely 3 acts of receptivity, 3 acts of leisure, 3 acts of receiving, which is critical to this idea of what authentic leisure or authentic rest is about. The first one is the habit of solitude and of daily silence. And by the way, it's really important just to get silence in your life. In fact, the danger of the earbuds is a serious issue. You should try to find ways to disconnect from them. But then here's the real challenge. Not only if you can get just silence out there, the challenge then is, how do you get the silence in here? I don't know about you, but I got tapes going on in my head. I've been having tapes going on in my head all my life. And here are the tapes. I am the unappreciated genius at the University of St. Thomas. If they would just listen to me. I walk to school, it's about a 2-mile walk, and I can solve almost every problem in that 2 miles, right? I have debates with my colleagues all the time, and by the way, I've won every debate. I always come up on top in my head, only if it was only so true out in reality, right? That is, I have all these speeches going on in my head, all these tapes going on in my head, and they're not really bad. But what happens is I can't receive. The tape is preventing me from receiving the word I need to hear. That's why daily silence, shutting off the tape, is of such critical importance. Not occasionally, but daily. And if we don't do it daily, we don't hear what we're supposed to be hearing. The second habit is the habit of celebration, and particularly weekly Sabbath. And here, we simply have to look to the Jews. The Jews do a far better job on the question of Sabbath than most Christians. They take it seriously. It's a serious act. I often say, if I treated adultery like I treat the Sabbath, honey, I tried it this week, didn't quite work, but I'll try next week, right? If that was the case in my marriage, it would be an absolute wreck. And yet Sabbath is sometimes the thing that we often find. It's the Big Ten. It's one of the Big Ten. And yet we find ourselves easily dismissing it in that type of reality. But thirdly is the habit of service, of going to the margins. By the way, before I get to that, let me have a challenge to all of you sitting in this room. I'd challenge you to become, I love this phrase, a techno-Sabbatarian. A techno-Sabbatarian. Isn't that a strange word, right? That is, I encourage you, I challenge you to take 4 hours of being disconnected from your devices. Try it. And if you can do 4, maybe even go up to 8. If you do 8, maybe you can do it for the whole day. That is a very hard thing for people to do. And if you can't do 4, do 1. Put it away for an hour. And if you can't do it, you got a problem. It's called fixation, it's called addiction. They're now calling it internet anxiety. We're often not that important where we can be disconnected, because that's what the Sabbath is all about, becoming disconnected. Let me throw out one more thesis. I gave you the thesis. If we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. If we don't get the Sabbath right, we won't get Monday right. The Sabbath is of critical importance. But thirdly, let me go back to the habit of service, of going to the margins. And here, within the Christian tradition, it's hard to read the Gospels and not think that we don't have an important reality of being connected to the poor. Not in such a way that we go to them and say, I am doing things for you, but that we go to the poor and we can be with them. And when you are with the poor in a vulnerable way, they will give you things that no one else can give you. It's often that Jesus and often the tradition will often talk about the importance of voluntarism and being with those on the margins, particularly on the Sabbath. This is why Jesus heals on the Sabbath, the difference between Judaism and Christianity. So these 3 habits, I think, are of critical importance to this idea of stability, up to the good, up to the change. So let me give you an example, or a story, I should say, with Mother Teresa. I met Mother Teresa twice in my life. Once was in Chicago and once was in Calcutta, India. And when I was in Calcutta, I was giving a talk at the Indian Institute of Management. And my host was Hindu. And he knew I was Catholic. And he says, would you like to go meet Mother Teresa? I said, sure. So we hopped in the cab, went down to the Mother House, and there she was. We walked in, there she was. And my Hindu friend drops to his knees and he's trying to kiss her feet. And Mother Teresa's trying to pick him up, and he's trying to kiss her. This is kind of wrestling match going on right in front of me, right? And honest to goodness, I kid you not, I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs, and the only thought I had in my mind was, man, she has big feet. God, she is so short. Boy, she is old. And aren't you an idiot that you can't think of something more profound? I mean, here I am sitting in the icon of holiness, and all I can think about were feet. Well, we had about a 20-minute conversation, and she was delightful. She told us about her work. We told her about our work. And as we were leaving, she says, I want to give you my business card. And there was no fax number, no email, no nothing. This is what was on her business card. The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace. Mother Teresa started every day of her life in silence. Now you may think she's a nice little old nun who looked kind of holy in holy cards. The woman was running an organization that had operations in over 80 countries. She was a very busy woman. But she knew she had to start in her day in deep receptivity for her to understand the work that she was going to do. And that idea of receptivity is of critical importance. So, let me begin to wrap up. If I understand my work as a vocation, and then understanding my leisure as contemplation, that creates the ingredients for real integrity. I want to recognize the importance of the work of the Center for Integrity of Business here at Seattle Pacific University. It's a wonderful title for a center, and the importance of it is of critical dimensions for business today. So let me highlight a few things on this word integrity. Again, it comes from the Latin word integritas, and it actually has 2 meanings, at least in the tradition. And the one which is most common is, it's actually where we get the word integer, a whole number. Integrity is about the idea of becoming whole, of integrating the parts that we have. But there's a second definition which is not as popular or is not as well known, but it's very interesting, and it is to be untouched or unblemished. And I'd like to come back to that, but I want to keep it out there. It is, I think, a very important part of the definition that tells us something about integrity that we need to take seriously. And this integrity, of course, is, in many respects, the heart of what leadership is about. And all of us should be striving for this idea that we are leaders with great integrity. And I think if you put the question of leisure and work together, I think this is not the only phrase, but we become contemplative practitioners. We don't just become doers, we don't just become contemplatives, but we become both, a contemplative practitioner. It's very interesting, I know many of you know Jim Collins' work, and it's very interesting how he kind of talks about the two major elements of a great leader. He talks about those with great resolve, because if you're not a doer, if you're not disciplined, if you're not hardworking, and by the way, this talk is not about taking it easy. We have to have great resolve in the work we do. You will not achieve things. You will be a poor leader. It is the necessary, but here's the key thing, insufficient element of a great leader. And what's great about Collins is he talks about that the second area is humility, which in many respects is how he defines it, is precisely in this term of receptivity. It's interesting, if you look at Collins' work, where do people get humility from? It's not from their work. It's from their culture. It's from their family. It's from their religion. It's from sickness. It's from being put simply on their back. That's why leisure is so important. That's why culture is so important. So, my little matrix. Let me say a couple more things about this, and then we'll wrap up. It's simply a pedagogical tool. Actually, we could add a whole nother layer of boxes there and get a more texture dimension to it. But it's just to get the ideas out. But one of the things I want to highlight is that a lot of times we find ourselves, we may look at our work as vocation, but we find our leisure in terms of pure utility. And the point of the matrix is simply saying that's creating a tension. And that's making integrity more difficult. And some of us may see our work as a career and we find ourselves in forms of contemplation, but we're also not living the way we should be living in that area of work. Point number one. Point number two, there's nothing wrong with work as a career. First of all, let me be very clear. I work for money, and I love it when my academic vice president says to me, you know what, you've done a great job. We're going to promote you. Getting full professor was a wonderful thing. In business, it's wonderful when your work is, in a sense, recognizable and they promote you up that proverbial ladder. There's nothing wrong with work as a career. Here's the challenge. It's simply too small. It is too small of a view of work. God has a hard time interacting with people who only see the work as a career. Augustine has a great line in the Confessions, and he says this, "The house of my soul is too small for you to come to it. May it be enlarged by you." The Christian tradition is trying to enlarge the understanding of what work is about, which is why it uses this term vocation. Last point, integrity. I started off this talk talking about my own particular division and the idea of a divided life. And what the idea of integrity is how do you make it whole? How do we make it whole? But the other definition is this idea of being untouched. Too often, many of us claim, almost glibly, that we have integrity. I think that's a very dangerous thing in which to do. We can more approximate it than what we have, but integrity is a lifelong project. One should be very careful of it glibly claiming it, because all of us have been touched. All of us are blemished. All of us are divided. And some of us are further down that road of recognizing it than others. But the whole idea of life, it is a human project, and it takes a long time for that to be overcome. So, let me finally conclude with a quote. The document that I mentioned, The Vocation of the Business Leader, is going in its 4th edition, which we're working on right now. And what we've done is that we've tried to bring in Francis, Pope Francis, who has been having some interesting effects on the world. And there's a quote from him that I find very helpful, and I like to end the talk with this. And I think it highlights the idea of a contemplative practitioner. And it goes like this. Francis says, "Without prolonged moments of adoration, of prayerful encounter with the Word, of sincere conversation with the Lord, our work easily becomes meaningless. We lose energy as a result of weariness and difficulties, and our fervor dies out. Without a deep well of spiritual reflection," the document goes on to say, "it is hard to see, for example, how business leaders can resist the negative dimensions of information technology that drive speed and efficiency at the expense of thoughtful reflection, patience, justice, and practical wisdom. Information technologies encourages us toward instantaneous decisions. Thus, they can create their own logic that undermines the application of the social principles of the church unless they are used in an ordered way by contemplative practitioners." The thesis of this talk is that leisure is of critical importance, of contemplation, of the Sabbath, of daily silence, and it is at the heart of what it means to have the vocation of the business leader, for us to go out into the world and change that world as the gospel often encourages us. So thanks for your time, and I appreciate your attentiveness. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Naughton. Appreciate that. We have a lot of time, or some time, as much as you can, I think about half an hour at least, to ask Dr. Naughton some questions and interact with his talk. So please feel free to stand up and project your voice like I'm trying to do, and share your question with everybody so Dr. Naughton can respond. So I'll throw it open to the floor. Thank you.
And the first 6 people will get a copy of the Vocation of the Business Leader. How about that? You got it right there. How's that for an incentive? Why not? So give that man a copy.
Could you describe a little more personally how you carry this out in your daily life? The vocation, the idea of vocation that you expressed.
Yes. Well, in one sense, I should confess about how I don't. My wife, I do think this, much of my talk, by the way, they're not my ideas. I've been heavily influenced by a German philosopher, Joseph Pieper, who wrote a book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And I think he captures very well the Christian tradition. So I do give a lot of talks on this question. So if I'm going to give a talk and my wife says, "So what are you talking about?" Leisure. What? Leisure, right? And of course, we've had a lot of come to Jesus talks about my leisure and my work ethic. I would say one of the moments that when I started working at the university, of course I had to get tenure, I had to publish. My wife and I were broke. I was working, it wasn't a lot of money. We bought a fixer-upper house, and of course I was doing a lot of the work on it. And we really were going 7 days a week and things of that sort. And we started to recognize the problems that were occurring. And we actually read some very interesting books on the Sabbath. And we started reading them together. And finally we both made a commitment that we were not going to work on Sunday. No work. And I rationalized it all sorts of different things, Well, I'm a theologian, I'm doing God's work, and it's okay for me to, you get the rationalization starts to occur all the time. And I have to tell you, that day, it felt like Christmas. It was an extraordinary, I remember the day that we intentionally said, that day we were not going to work on the Sabbath. And I think it may be too strong to say, but I think it saved our marriage. Because on that day, we get up and we pray together and we talk and we pray and we talk. And a lot of things start to get brought up. And it's just a great day of leisure. But at the heart of it is that prayer. So for that, I think is of critical importance, the Sabbath. I can't tell you how important it has been to our family. Now, that doesn't mean we live it perfectly every day. My wife and I are having more come to Jesus talks because I travel on the weekends. And she's really trying to get me to simply stop that. And there's competing goods that go along with this. Sometimes, particularly international travel, it's hard to say no because of the trips that I need to go on to and things of that sort. So it's a constant kind of challenge. So that would be one area. The second one is this idea of daily silence. A man named Thomas Keating, he's a Cistercian monk. In the Catholic tradition, we call it the Benedictine tradition. And Benedict actually, there's a whole, in the Christian tradition, the monasticism that started in the early church is something that has certainly gone throughout the church. And Keating is very interesting, Thomas Keating, because he actually has been trying to translate this monastic tradition, which has been largely for religious and priestly life, and he's trying to translate it in for lay people. And that I have found to be very powerful. And that's where the importance of silence. Keating talks about contemplative prayer, or centering prayer is how sometimes some people call it. And the importance of stopping the tapes. And there's a whole discipline. It's the discipline of silence, which is shot through our whole tradition. And he talks about a couple of things. One is just sitting down and breathing in and breathing out. Because, by the way, we're enfleshed, embodied beings. And sometimes our bodies get in the way, and we have to calm down the body. And then he points out is take a word. My word is Jesus. And he says, breathe that word, the Jesus prayer. And Jesus, every time I get a thought, say the word Jesus. And after a while, the thoughts start to rest. And then as those thoughts start to rest, you break open Scripture, and it comes alive in a way that just can't often happen by me just sitting down and reading it. And so that we prepare ourselves to receive that word. So that would be, and Keating has written several books on this, and other people have written about it, about the importance. And those, I would say, would be those two areas in terms of the leisure question. Now, I haven't gotten to the work question, which we can get to, but those two have been very important in my life for that. Thanks for the question.
Yes.
I'm not going to stand there because I don't know, but the Gospels, the four Gospels, don't talk much about work. And it's kind of interesting because apart from Matthew, who's the tax collector, the rest of the apostles appear to have been laborers, right? Fisher people. So work would have been a big chunk of their day, every day. But Jesus never, as quoted in the Gospels, never talks about work explicitly. Why do you think the Gospel writers didn't address this?
It's interesting, though, isn't it? The parables are often about all workers, aren't they? Not about work, but he uses the workers to illumine the story of which he often is kind of an eschatological point and a moral point and things of that sort. Of course, you're asking, I'm a Catholic. I'm not as scripturally based as you guys. We should get a good Protestant theologian here who would know the scriptures probably better than I do. It's a great... I think the scriptures are always, of course, pointing us to the end. And by knowing the end, then you can know the way in which you have to get there. And so I would say that when one looks at the Beatitudes, the commandments, the teachings of those types of things, Jesus, as we know, never wrote anything. He only wrote one thing, and that was in the ground. And he was trying to give a vision. And if that vision could be articulated, we can start to see how that can be applied in our lives. Maybe, let me give you, when we wrote this book, The Vocation of the Business Leader, I was in charge of the third section. And it was the act. I said, see, judge, and act. And so I had this whole list of activities. You know, I was going through all the things about compensation, about process, about governance, about this, about that. And it was one of those things, I gave it to the committee, and they all kind of looked at it, and it just had nothing. It had no inspiration. It was just a list of practices, right? And it seems to me that while practices are important, no doubt about it, there are certain ways that you want to try to get to something higher, which then will inform the practices. rather than just going to the practices. And I wonder whether Jesus had that kind of vision. I'm not a scripture scholar. I've taken my scripture classes in theology when I was getting my Ph.D. But I suspect there are people in this room in the theology department could answer this much better than I can. But I think maybe because he actually doesn't talk a lot about family either, right? I mean, there's a lot of things, he doesn't talk a lot about tax, he doesn't talk a lot about the government, right? So there's a lot of things he doesn't talk about. But what we would say is that the gospel informs a particular kind of vision that can help us speak to these areas. And that's our hard work. Let me throw this back at you. This is the hard work of business schools and Christian universities, which have largely not done the work. And I say that more about my own tradition of Catholic business schools, that we have not done a very good job helping people understand the implications of the gospel within the area of business. And that's why I think this institution is so important, and all faith-based institutions that would have a business school, that these are the entities that should be helping us understand what are the implications of the gospel in what? A very complicated, globalized system that doesn't have easy answers, but there are answers. There are ways of proceeding. There are ways of doing. So, great question. Yes, back here, please.
When you speak of principles of learning and the different pillars of where these vocational, in your matrix that you set up, where these are going and where it will take us, it seems like a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of achievement that you've experienced and been able to adjust throughout your life. What would be a good starting point for a young student or somebody who maybe wouldn't be able to digest all of that at once?
Right. Great question. Actually, the vocation of the business leader. Give that man a copy, right? I mean, that was actually, your question was exactly the purpose of that document. It was an attempt to distill the important. Let me give you an analogy. You guys have maple syrup up here in the Great Northwest, right? You know how many gallons it takes to make a gallon of how much sap it takes to make a gallon of maple syrup? Anybody? About 40 gallons it takes to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. And the point is, your question is exactly right. This is a huge tradition. Both the Catholic and Protestant tradition have great resources in which to bring forward. But it's hard to read Luther, it's hard to read Aquinas, it's hard to read an encyclical for practitioners and say, well, what does that mean for me in the work that I'm doing? Some people can do it. I've met a few, but most don't. And so this document was a document that was trying to take the fullness of that tradition and boil it down in a way that can say, this doesn't exhaust it, but it gives you a good sense about what this tradition means and what the gospel means as it relates to the question of business. The churches haven't done a very good job at this. They haven't done a horrific job at it. I mean, there's places where it's succeeded, but that was the purpose of the document, of trying to boil that down, and that was actually the point of the document. Now, one quick little story. So I was on the drafting committee of this document, and you could imagine the document is 30 pages long. Our first draft was only 10 pages long. And you may say, yeah, well, see, those academics, they can't keep it brief. They just got to talk and talk and talk and talk. But it wasn't the academics, actually. It was actually the business. It was particularly a man named Pierre Lecoq. He's a French businessman. He is actually the CEO of a $2 billion auto supply parts. They make fuel injection systems. They have about 12 different plants around the world. And what he said was, it's okay, but I want something more reflective. I want something a little substantive. I want something deeper. I don't want a whole encyclical. I don't want a whole book, but give me something more. And that was actually the kind of wrestling of making something short enough that's digestible, as you're pointing about, but also making something substantive enough that says, oh, there's something more here. So, great question. Thank you. Yes?
With such a focus on what we do and in our culture, how do we make sure that our career does not define us, but more that we define our career?
Great question. So how do we make sure that our career is not defining us, but we can define the career? This is a real challenge. This is a serious challenge. There's no kind of easy answers here. And I'm not here, I can't say to you that your faith will either make you more successful or less successful. The variables are way too complex for that. Just like, the finance prof may say, if you maximize shareholder wealth, you will be more successful. The fact is that's not true. It's true in some cases, but not in all cases. And so the idea we want to be careful of is that whatever we do is going to make us, it will make us, I think, happier, but it may not necessarily make us more successful in the career. But there's a lot of times where it will. So with that caveat, I would have to simply go back to that you need a deep center. A Lutheran friend of mine, he actually was over at Luther Seminary in Twin Cities. He once said to me this, which I found to be very helpful. He says, speak from your center and not from your boundaries. Right? Speak from your center and not from your boundaries. Then he said, by the way, but speak from your center in such a way that you invite the other to do the same. The danger for many of us is we can speak from our center in such a way that we tend to impose rather than propose. And he says this for lots of reasons. But one of the things that he's trying to get at is that so many of us don't want to offend. That is, let me put it this way. So many of us speak from our boundaries in this very safe, very bland, and actually very boring place. But it's safe. You won't offend. You won't get into trouble. But they're pretty bland, boring places. But speak from that center. And the tragedy, of course, to modern life is, do people know what their center is? Do I know what the center is? Do I know, back to the beginning of the talk, do I know about that which does not change? Because if everything changes, you have no center. And so what are those things that don't change? And that, I think, ultimately is always going to come to the question of faith and the question of family. These are the two primary institutions of human culture. They define the moral compass, and they define often the center of what it is. And thus, if you have that strong core, that will then do two things for work. One is it will limit work. It will limit the career. And that's what good culture does. It limits economic and political realities, where either the state or the market doesn't seem to take over the realm. But if the cultural institutions are weak, what becomes dominant? The state and the market. And thus, I would say, if you don't want the career to define you, make sure you have that core. And I would say that the family and the faith is going to be critical parts of that. That's why the practices are so important. Daily silence, Sabbath, worship, retreats, and other things of that sort. Sound all right? Great question. Thank you. Yes, Denise.
Michael, David Brooks writes about eulogy virtues and resume virtues, which struck me as very similar to your concepts of integrity and achievement in terms of the integration that people are pursuing. So resume virtues would be those things that we try to pursue in order to beef up the resume, or maybe for students to apply to college or whatever it might be. And eulogy virtues are those things that people talk about at our eulogies, the characteristics of who we are. It seems to me that from an institutional perspective, and I think about SPU, I think about business school, I think about my role as a professor, we often are really trying to cultivate resume virtues, unfortunately. How do we do that differently? How do we institutionally try to cultivate the pieces of the eulogy virtues?
That's a great question. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with resume virtues, right? I mean, we want to be very clear that particularly in the business school, we want to help our students get jobs. As a parent of 5 children, and I've had 2 just graduate, and I got another one in there, there's something debilitating about students who come out and well, what do I do now? What do I do now? It's interesting. I got to tell you an interesting story. I'm going to get to the answer, but since we got some time. A good friend of mine, son, just graduated from Boston College. And it was very interesting. He graduated as an English major, and he was been wrestling with his son about getting him a job. And the son's having a hard time getting one. And what was interesting is he thought about his own fatherhood. He started to see that he had a problem. And the problem was this. He emphasized 2 major things with his son. One is to get really good grades. And the second was to do really well in sports. And those things took up his son's time since he was from kindergarten into college. But the one thing he never taught his son was how to work. And so I do think what I want to do is highlight the importance of resume virtues, that there's something about what we want to do is help our students understand the nature of work and what it takes to do the work in our society. And I think, I haven't read the article by Brooks, although I think he's brilliant in many other things. But that doesn't answer the question about this, what you would call eulogy virtues. And I would probably say, I would like to take the guess that actually he probably meant cardinal and theological virtues. And this is what the tradition, Aquinas is, the Summa Theologica, 2/3 of it is all in the virtues. And the way Aquinas describes the virtues is that the cardinal virtues are what he calls the hinge virtues. These are the things and what he means by the hinging is like a hinge of a door. And these virtues are connected to what? They're connected to the way that we operate. They're not just random virtues. By the way, I once asked a student, I said, can you name me the 4 cardinal virtues? And they said, prudence, justice, temperance, and fornication. No, fortitude, right? Anyhow. That's where it goes sometimes. I hope he didn't really mean it, but he might have, who knows? But Aquinas understands this. And by the way, one of the great modern theologians is Stanley Hauerwas, who has really kind of retrieved the Thomistic virtues, and he's a Protestant theologian. And he's done a great job of retrieving this long tradition of the cardinal virtues. But what is Aquinas with? He says prudence or practical wisdom is related to the mind, the brain, the intellect. Justice is related to the will. And fortitude and temperance are related to the passions. And these virtues guide the way that we operate. They guide the way that we should be acting as human beings. And you're exactly right. The danger of the business school, the danger of entrepreneur. We wrote a book, I wanted to call it The Good Entrepreneur, but the publisher had a different idea. But in most entrepreneurship, they talk about virtues, but what do they talk about? Diligence, industriousness. They might eventually get the courage, but they don't talk about justice. They don't talk about temperance. But these are the virtues, the reason why Aquinas calls them hinge virtues, these are the virtues that make us human. Virtue brings us to that human capacity because we're using our faculties, our brains, our will, our passions in the right way. So those cardinal virtues are key to retrieve and try to see their applications within the business realm. Now, on top of that are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Because of the human condition, cardinal virtues will always eventually fail us. And that is why the grace that's necessary in terms of the cardinal virtues are of critical importance. Does that help, Denise? Yes, thank you.
You said something earlier in your talk about the dilemma, and I'll shortly in the next 2 years be retiring, and I've noticed people are starting to flood me with the question of, what are you going to do? And the implication is retirement is a death sentence. And I always feel like saying, well, I'm going to continue to live and enjoy life and be curious and learn and do all the things I hope I've done as a faculty member. And I'm just wondering if perhaps this exists. We need to start a train of thought of retirement as vocation, because you look at the demographic that I'm in and that so many of us are in, and I notice some people are continuing work because they love it, but I also sense fear in many of my contemporaries about moving away from work and not knowing what's beyond. And it really dismays me when I see statistics like the first people fired during a recession are the young people. It just feels wrong to me not to make a place for younger people coming into the workforce. And so where do some of us in my demographic find a moral compass about vocation moving on from?
Right. I think you're absolutely right, by the way. The demographic change that's occurring of this baby boom generation that's moving into retirement is of massive cultural importance. And if one could say massive spiritual poverty that can often occur with that. And yet it is such a beautiful opportunity for such tremendous growth that can occur in somebody's life. I have a colleague, unfortunately, he just passed away, Terry Nichols. And actually, remember we had a conversation about this a couple of years ago, and he wanted to start an institute precisely on this question. Because we have one of the most massive numbers of people moving into retirement right now. And if you don't address this on a spiritual level, it could be catastrophic. Let me give you an example. And again, I know it's just an example. But my father-in-law, who's retired, actually he retired at 60 from Wisconsin State School System, and he has a long pension. I mean, he's going to be on that pension he's a very healthy guy, he's coming near 80. But he one time went down to Florida with his wife died, and he went down with a friend, and he spent several months there, and he says it was probably the 3 most depressing months of his life. He says because they got there and they kind of slept until 10, they got up and they met with another group of people and they would have a Bloody Mary before lunch. And he says all they did was complain. Complained about the government, complained about younger people, complained about this. And he said it just felt spiritually dead. Now, not all retirement communities are like that. But there is a dilemma about how you move through that retirement and what are the spiritual disciplines that are necessary to make you more human in that area. And thus then raises the question, retirement is not just simply spending your children's inheritances, as often the bumper stickers tells us. There is something has to be more meaningful as you move into it, but it should be clear that it's not just another work area. You're actually moving toward death. This is something that a lot of people like to simply escape. And thus, the contemplative life should be maybe have greater importance in that stage. Also, having meaning. How does the grandparent serve the family if you have the family? What's the relationship you have with your grandkids? What is the relationship you have with the kids? You know, my kids are eventually going out and say, okay, they're out of the house, I'm done with them. Yeah, right. It doesn't work that way. That's still a relationship. What is that nature of that relationship? Sometimes retired people can find other ways. I have a friend of mine who often talks about retiring is to retire, put new tires on. And one of the things he pointed out is that where does he get energy? And he says, I get energy from young people. So he would come into my class and he would always guest speak and he was always available for me. He was a great business person and he would do all sorts of things at the university. And that was one way that he spent his retirement. But he did take more time with it. So there's a lot to be said on that. I'm sure there's other people who probably say more than I can, but that would be just a quick response to it. Great question. Thank you.
Yes? I have an acquaintance that is dying of cancer, and he's blogging as he writes. And in one of his blogs, he wrote that for much of his life, he had lived with a carpe diem, seize the day mentality. And now he is living with a welcome the day. And my wife and I have talked a fair bit about this, and it has struck me that perhaps it's a developmental thing. That at some seasons of life, it is more important to be seizing the day, and at other points, to welcome the day.
Right.
Which takes me to your talk, and I wonder whether there is some developmental piece that, as you maybe just suggested, that contemplative, while always important, might be of less importance. I'm not sure that's the right phrasing, but the work might be more important early on. And that these, do you have any sense of it, or anything to respond to?
Yeah, I think, practically speaking, I think you're right. We don't want to say less important, because what happens is if you lose touch of it, it often tends to bite you later on, because then you're totally unprepared as you move into retirement. And the point that I want to make is that there's a sense of integration. But when you're in professional work and you have family and you have kids and you have bills to be met, it's hard to take that time, particularly depending on the work that you're doing that is demanding it. But if you allow that demand to cover everything, it starts to distort. And that's why the word balance doesn't quite work. Because we can think of balance in one of two ways. One of the things we can do is think of balance as sequentialism. I'll come to that later. Think about it. What if you did that with your food? Okay, I'll eat meat for a couple of years, and then the next couple of years I'll eat the vegetables, and then after a couple of years of that I'll go and eat the fruits. We know that that would not be a very good diet. But sometimes we have this sense of saying, well, I'm too busy for that. No. This is actually, some people would often say, if you don't have time to pray for 15 minutes, you should be praying for an hour, right? There's always sometimes, and there's ways in which to take that time for it. But practically speaking, I'm not retired. I don't have all the time of the day, unlike my CEO friend who does. And there's limits about what I can put in the day. But I have to make sure that I place it as part of that discipline to make it a reality. Because what it does is, again, two things. What does it do? It first limits my work, your question, that the career doesn't take over. But here's the other thing it does. It also informs the meaning of my work. That's what leisure does. It doesn't just distract us from work. It detaches us from it. But in that detachment, I can come back to my work in such a way that I begin to understand what it is really about. And if I sever myself from that, I will often lose track of it. But practically speaking, I would love, so for example, on Sunday morning, we've been able to do this. We will pray for a couple hours. It is glorious. But I can't pray for 2 hours throughout the week. There's just too much darn work to get done. And I often find even 20 minutes sometimes to be difficult. But at least I got to say, I'm going to take that 20 minutes. It's probably insufficient. I should probably be doing better, but it's part of the life. But practically speaking, I think you're absolutely right. The time of which one is at is going to be different, but they have to be always there, if that makes sense. Great question. Thank you. Yes, Ross.
Mike, you talk about the logic of gift for an individual's vocation. Can you talk a little bit about the logic of gift for business as an institution and what some of those practices might look like?
Right. Let me just say one word about the logic of gift, and I'll get to it. In one document that Benedict wrote where he talks about this issue, he talks about that charity is a love that is received and given. It's kind of like the way we breathe. We breathe in, we breathe out. Charity is a love that is first received and given. And the document that Vocational Business Leader starts off with that scriptural verse that much has been given and much is expected. And I would say that that's true not only for a person, but it is also true for an institution, such as a business. And that's why those three goods, I think, begin to describe what that logic of gift, what is the gift that business provides for that. And so in terms of the institution, this idea of good goods, good work, and good wealth is the goods that often should be generating, which are the absolute necessary goods for a society to have. And thus you could talk about each one of those, the particular practices that would go in related to it. So the question for more practically speaking, so I'm the board chair of a company called Rail Precision Manufacturing. And the founders, 3 Protestant founders, engineers from 3M organization, left 3M, started their own company. And one of the interesting practices that they have is that they start their meetings in silence. They used to start in prayer, but then they found out because there was kind of the plurality that kind of happened, it was hard to get everyone in agreeing. Some people felt uncomfortable. So they just start in silence in this sense of receptivity. They also have I mentioned this to the group the other day, another friend of mine up in Montreal, they run a food processing plant over there, and Mother Teresa came to visit him, or visit Montreal, and he thought, oh good, you know, and he went to her and he says, would you come visit my plant? And she said, sure. She came and visited him. And at the end of the tour of the plant, the friend of mine who's the owner said, so any words you want to tell me? And she said, put a prayer room in here. Now, if you know anything about Quebec is like, it's even worse than Seattle in the sense of the pervasive secularization. It used to be very Catholic, and it just flipped. I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of cultural thing. And the hostility they have toward Christianity, toward Catholicism, is pretty deep. And he was like, you're not serious. He didn't say this to her. But as time went on, he kept on saying, okay, Mother Teresa told me to put a prayer room in here, and I'm not doing it. Should I be doing it? So he decided to put in a silent room. Instead of calling it a prayer room, he called it a silent room. And it was a very interesting experience because the plant manager, who I actually interviewed, thought it was a horrific idea. And he was very angry that he put it in there. But he was like, well, Mother Teresa told me to, and when Mother Teresa tells you to do it, particularly, you better go do it. And what was interesting is the plant manager, actually, this caused a real fight between the plant manager and the owner. And the plant manager would never go in the room. But here's what happened to the plant manager, which he had to eventually say to me. They actually did a survey of employees a year after the thing was in there about whether you'd want to keep it. 80% of the employees said they want to keep it. And I was telling the group yesterday, it was particularly the Muslims who were quite keen on it because it gave them a place to pray. And they were so grateful to this Catholic for providing this. But the real interesting story is that the plant manager, who was so angry about it, had to confess to me. He says, I will tell you, I've never been in this room. I don't think it should be here. I think it's proselytization. I think it's not what a business is all about. I think it's wasted space. He says, but I do got to tell you that silence keeps coming to me. And before I make decisions, I don't go into this room, but I go in my office and take time for silence. Now, I thought that was really interesting, just as a way for him to receive. So how do people within business, what are certain practices in which business can take time to receive? Thus, if you have an important decision, can you sleep on it? Can you rest on it? Maybe silent before meetings. It depends on the culture that you would have. It would depend on really on the culture that you have. But that would be maybe one example of that.
We have time for one more question. Steve.
So, Michael, you've talked about goods and goods and goods, good work and good goods and good wealth, and in many ways they're all about a good life. And I think about somebody that has helped me think about this. I wonder what you would say to Walker Percy's observation that we can get all A's and still flunk life. And when you think about work as vocation, what would understanding that idea mean in terms of pushing back against that temptation which lurks around everyone's heart that it's okay, it's possible to, in fact, I might in fact get all A's and yet still flunk life?
You know, it's a pretty, someone like Walker Purser is there's a kind of prophetic punch that Walker Percy provides. Someone like Dorothy Day would be another person who I have great admiration for. Flannery O'Connor, we've been talking about that. And these are people that often in the tradition, I think, serve as a similar role of what the prophets did in the Old Testament. They're often outside of the system, and they can be annoying. They can be challenging. But these are the people that we need to constantly be listening to. And so I do think they're right. We can get all A's. We can create companies where we can achieve all the goods, but possibly in the process lose the soul that goes along with that. Which is why I think the leisure question is the critical question. Because you need that grounding within the culture, within the spiritual life, within the scriptures, on a daily basis that continue to ground you in that idea that you, in a sense, don't fall into the illusion that these things are permanent. I'll give you a quick example. I don't know if this will work or not, but the former U.S. Senator of Minnesota, a man named David Durenberger, and we had this series in Minneapolis, Faith and Work series, and we invited him to speak. And of course, note our timing. He's a committed Catholic. He actually was in the parish in this downtown Minneapolis area. 2 weeks before the talk, he's on the front page of the paper dealing with tax evasion. Right? And then we thought, well, maybe this is a good time for us to disinvite him. But we thought, no, let's go with it, and let's just see what happens. We're all sinners. Let's see what happens. And we were really hesitant because we were just starting up this Faith and Work series, and it felt like it could be a scandal and things of that sort. And he started off his talk, first of all, telling us about all the great things that people talked about him. You know, what George Bush said about him, and what former governors said about him, and he was name dropping one after the other, all these great political leaders that everyone would have known at the time. And I'm thinking, oh man, we have made a huge mistake. Why are we doing this? I mean, this is going nowhere. This is going to be bad. And then after this whole litany of all these things that people have said about him, he stopped. And he says, I got to tell you, I made one mistake. I actually believe what they said about me. And then he went on in a profound confession, right there in front of the whole group. And I've been told that they've never heard Dave Durenberger speak like that before. Right? Now, Dave Durenberger has done a lot of great things, if you look at all the great things that he did. But there is something about what the world, even though all those great things were occurring, there is something about the world, even in the so-called goodness of it, that was covering up a false self. And it took this kind of episode of tax evasion to come to it. It's helpful when those things can be done voluntarily rather than been done through the scandal. So I like your phrase that we can get all A's in life and still flunk. I haven't, as I mentioned to you the other day, I've only read one thing of Walker Percy Lancelot, and I never went back to Percy after that. But I suspect I should have, because I've heard so many people speak about it. This is why literature is so important for all of us. It's why voices, these kind of prophetic voices, are so important to the church. And they tell us things that often our work won't be able to tell us. So on that note, let me end with one more voice. And this voice is a man named John Henry Newman. And Newman has been a great kind of mentor. He lived in the 19th century, an intellectual in England. And I think he captures, I hope, what the heart of this vocation is all about. And Newman says this. He says, God created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it fully in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary to his purposes. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connections between persons. He has not created me for naught. God has not created us for nothing. He's created us for great purpose. It's not always easy to figure that out, in particularly the modern culture that we live in. But it is at the heart of the Christian gospel that we have been called, that we've been given great gifts, and we are called to give great life. And I think you are at a great university that actually helps you to do that. And I think you should count yourself as very blessed to be here. And it's been a great blessing for me to be here. So thank you very much.